Welcome to episode 12 of the Extremely Non-Extreme podcast. I am the host, Quentin Wittrock. We are privileged to have with us today a prominent lawyer and former judge to discuss the intersection of law and politics. My guest is Greg Pinski. Most of Greg's career has been a lawyer in high-stakes cases all around the United States, with a practice based first in Minnesota and then in his home state of Montana. In 2013, Greg was elected to serve as a judge in Montana's state court system, which he did for 8 years. Since that time, he has acted as a lawyer, a mediator, and arbitrator in private practice. Welcome to the program, Greg, or should I call you Judge Pinski?
No, please call me Greg. You've known me too long to call me anything else. And like I always tell people, no matter what they called me as a judge, I've always been called worse. So Greg is perfect.
I know that. The topic of today's podcast is lawfare, the Supreme Court, judicial independence, and the role of lawyers, judges, and litigation generally in today's American politics. Uh, Greg, as I watch politics very closely, as far as I can tell, rather than the federal laws being passed through Congress, it mostly goes like this, today at least. The Trump administration takes or announces action largely through executive orders or on social media, such as deploying the National Guard to cities, imposing tariffs on foreign goods, firing federal workers, firing independent agency officials. Then the administration immediately gets sued. Lower courts temporarily stop the president, and the administration then appeals. And often the appeals courts let the president do what he wanted to do. As a lawyer and former judge, can you please tell us how this process works?
Well, absolutely. And I mean, we could obviously spend hours debating and talking about the concept of governing by executive order, which seemingly over the course of not only the Trump administration, but before that, has really gotten out of control. And we've centralized so much power in the executive branch. But putting the legislation by executive order aside, what's happening in these situations is when these executive orders come down, the affected parties go into court on an emergency basis and ask the courts to intervene quickly. I mean, as we all know, the legal system can take years to play out. And in many of these instances, years is too long. So they go in and they ask for a temporary restraining order, preliminary injunction, as it's called, to stop this from happening. And the best example that I can use outside of the political world on the types of things you get injunctions for is, if you have an employee of Coca-Cola who has stolen the secret formula and has gone to work for Pepsi and is about to disclose it. And so Coke runs into court quickly and says, Judge, if you don't stop this rogue employee from disclosing our formula, we're going to be harmed forever. And there's no putting the toothpaste back in the tube. And so we need an emergency order stopping this from happening. And so those are the types of emergency situations. You need to show that you're going to be irreparably harmed, meaning there's no money that can compensate you for what's going to happen. You got to stop this right away. You got to show that you're likely to succeed on the merits because you're asking a court to intervene within days of a lawsuit being filed before there's any information that's exchanged. And you have to show just sort of that this is in the public interest and that the harms out for the party not getting the injunction outweigh the harms for the other party. So this is what they're showing. This is what they're doing. They're going into court on an emergency basis and asking the courts to intervene early.
So the plaintiff is saying it's going to be impossible to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. We have to order him not to fall. And but then this always then gets appealed, or later there is some different standard that allows the emergency order to be set aside, and then the appeals court says, okay, you can go ahead and do it, President.
Yeah, that's what's happening, right? These injunctions are getting entered and they're going up through the appellate process. Sometimes, in some of these instances, they're skipping parts of the appellate process, right, and going right to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is extraordinarily rare and difficult to do in the ordinary course of a lawsuit that's filed. But typically, we always kind of say that cases are won and lost at the injunction stage, because what you're really after, when you take a lawsuit through the full continuum of what a case goes through over the course of several years, you're typically looking for monetary damages or some other type of relief. Whereas in these types of cases, the plaintiffs, the affected parties, are looking for an order to stop happening what the executive orders are doing. And so then those are immediately appealed. And one of the things that really just strikes me on these appeals that are happening on these executive orders, appellate courts normally isn't the court where facts are developed or where the case is developed, right? And that usually occurs down in the trial court where they're presenting evidence and judges are making rulings. But these appellate courts are really going above and beyond to, in my opinion, engage in fact finding, which is contrary really to the traditional role that a federal appellate court plays.
All right. Conversely, we have another genre of political litigation these days, which is President Trump, either through his personal lawyers or through the U.S. Department of Justice, which it seems to me he's using as his personal lawyers. The president initiates legal proceedings. He has private lawsuits, civil cases against places like CBS, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, even the Des Moines Register in my home state. And we hear a lot about Mr. Trump suing them, but then we don't hear much after that. What happens after a lawsuit like that is filed and publicized, and there's always these great claims of so and so sues so and so for $100 billion or whatever. What's the process after that?
Yeah. Well, the process in those cases is a little different because it involves the president of the United States, who has the bully pulpit, if you will, and it seems like constant fingers on his phone, sending out tweets and that sort of thing about these companies. And of course, if this was an ordinary individual or even a lesser a public figure of lesser stature that was bringing these lawsuits, I don't suspect that they would be ending the way that they are with the payment of, I think, boy, over the course of some of these defamation lawsuits coming up $60-70 million. I mean, these are, for the ordinary person, for the ordinary public figure, extraordinarily difficult lawsuits to win. And so, they're filed. There would be an extensive period of discovery where depositions would be taken. Normally, someone in a defamation lawsuit has to show that they've been harmed, particularly where it relates to their profession. So, the ordinary person would have to say, look, I was defamed. I lost my job. I lost my house. The emotional distress of it caused me to lose my marriage. I've had to seek medical attention because of all this stress, and this is the damage that it caused me. Well, that's not happening for President Trump, right? That ordinary damage to someone because of alleged defamation. I mean, he's reelected as president of the United States. His wealth is growing by the day. By the words of his physicians, he's in perfectly good health, whatever that means. So he's not suffering that economic harm that typically attaches to a defamation case. So what is he doing? Well, he's using these lawsuits and his ability to engage the public as the president of the United States to essentially extort money. I mean, I'm not suggesting that it's a crime in the extortion sense, but it is essentially legal extortion through these lawsuits. The companies don't like the publicity. They don't like to be in the crosshairs. So it's much easier for ABC to pay $15 million than it is for them to litigate this case with someone who captures the news cycle, hundreds, if not thousands of times during the course of a week.
I see that one of the settlements that was supposedly paid in President Trump's lawsuits against one of the networks, the money is now being put in this fund to pay for the new ballroom at the White House. The donors to the ballroom were listed in the newspapers this morning, and one of them is the $23 million received from ABC or CBS or somebody to settle their lawsuit that President Trump had brought. So it all just, what you're saying then, Greg, is these are not orthodox cases. This is, when I ask you how does this normally work, that's one question. How does it work when President Trump is the plaintiff is a whole nother story.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, we've seen this play out in a number of different instances, right? We've seen it play out in these alleged defamation lawsuits. We've seen this play out with colleges and universities. We've seen this, play out with law firms. Anybody that gets in Trump's crosshairs, he's been throughout, not just when he was president of the United States, but throughout his life, he has used the legal system to affect change, to try to get what he wants. And that may have had some limited success when he was a businessman in New York, but now that he's president of the United States, he's really able to use the legal system to really put these colleges, these businesses, these media outlets, in law firms into his crosshairs, and use that to exact what he wants from them.
And not only is he using his own lawyers to do this, now he is using the Justice Department, which he has access to and is treating as his lawyers to do his bidding. And he puts pressure on the Attorney General to appoint district attorneys who will bring criminal charges, against the likes of James Comey, the former FBI director, and Letitia James, a prosecutor who brought a case against him, and now John Bolton, his own former Secretary of National Security. As a former judge and still as an officer of the court, as all lawyers are considered to be, what's your reaction to that?
I mean, one of the first things, going back to law school, right? I mean, every lawyer in the United States is required to take a class in professional responsibility and take a test as part of the bar exam in professional responsibility. And one of the foundational principles of being licensed to practice law is avoiding conflicts of interest. And even in the judicial canons, for judges, even avoiding the appearance of impropriety is just a hallmark of our justice system. And so the fact that, you mentioned that he's treating these Justice Department lawyers as his own lawyers, well, in many instances, they've been his lawyers. I mean, Todd Blanche defended Donald Trump in court. I mean, the newly appointed U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, Lindsay Halligan, Lena Haba in New Jersey, these were his lawyers. These were his personal lawyers who are now doing things that to any first year law student studying professional responsibility would absolutely raise the appearance of impropriety and innumerable conflicts of interest. And we look at the newest thing that's come up this week, where it's come out. Trump wants the Justice Department to pay him $230 million for the investigations that happened during the Biden administration, and the very people that will be making that determination are his lawyers, right? Todd Blanche is the one that can approve that payment to Trump, and seemingly Trump could order him to do it. And so, we've sort of lost sight of these fundamental principles, and I think it just goes to the larger issue of totally undermining the public faith and trust in the justice system.
To me, one of the worst examples is not just the bringing of lawsuits, but the calling off of prosecutions of the president's political or personal allies, the dropped investigation of Tom Homan, who accepted a $50,000 in a fast food bag. The aborted prosecution of Mayor Eric Adams in New York, as part of a quid pro quo that Adams would then support Trump on some issues that were part of Trump's agenda. And now I think there was a deal cut with this Ms. Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell, to give her a cushier prison in return for saying she never saw Trump do anything wrong when he was hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein. All of this, plus the pardoning of friends who have been convicted, and most recently George Santos. We saw Rod Blagojevich. Trump's not the first person to pardon his friends and relatives. Joe Biden did that. Hunter Biden got pardoned. Other Bidens got pardoned. Joe
Bill
Biden pardoned a
Clinton,
lot of
yeah.
people, as have most presidents. But what's your thoughts on all of this?
Yeah, I think the this notion that we're going to use the justice system to exact revenge is challenging, right? And it's and to some degree, there's been undercurrents of that for decades. I mean, when you look back at the way, J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI for many years, right? He kept secret files on his enemies and things like that, but it wasn't ever taken to the degree that Trump is taking it, right? And I think there was just an article in the New York Times or the Washington Post, one of the two yesterday, about how the Justice Department has decided to use, politicians' mortgage applications to charge them with mortgage fraud, right, and lying to banks to obtain money, by declaring multiple primary residences. That's what he's done, with the Attorney General in New York. And this analysis showed that that's happened with both Democrats and Republicans. There's sitting Republican senators that have done the exact same thing and haven't been charged. So it brings up this notion of vindictive prosecution, which is an issue that's being raised by both James Comey and Letitia James. And vindictive prosecution is, it's a legal theory that is ordinarily very difficult to prove, right? You have to be able to show that the prosecution is singling you out and charging you with crimes for improper reason, that they have this retaliatory intent against you. And normally, for the average criminal defendant, they may think a prosecutor doesn't like them, but that's not enough. I mean, you have to show that the prosecutor's actually retaliating against you for something that you've done as part of the legal system. And so, but that's what James Comey and Letitia James are raising. And I think, from all the analysis that I've read, both conservative and liberal legal scholars say that there's some merit to this, right? Because of the public comments that Trump has made. I mean, he's talking about, even before he's elected president, that when he is elected president, he is absolutely going to go after those that have wronged him. He has singled out these people, actually named them. And now he has his Justice Department, he has ordered them to go after it. And in many instances where Justice Department officials are refusing, they're getting fired. He's putting his own personal lawyers in place to do that bidding for him. And I think that really, really strikes at the hallmark of what a vindictive prosecution is all about. So it's going to be interesting to see how those motions play out in those cases, in those federal courts, because it's not something that's common that happens, but it may very well be successful here.
So, in your two terms as a district court judge in Montana, I suppose you handled criminal and civil cases both?
Right.
So,
Yep.
as a judge, what can the judge do if the judge senses, hey, I think that they're going after this defendant here uh, for retribution or revenge or for personal reasons rather than for reasons that should be prosecuted under the law, or they're letting this defendant off because he's their friend. What's the judge's recourse in that situation?
Yeah, well, the judge's recourse is to intervene, right? I mean, the judge is sort of the last stop there from government overreach. And I always viewed, I guess, in my role as a judge, and geez, over the course of 8 years, I'll bet I processed 10,000 cases. Okay. And probably 3,000, 4,000 of them being criminal cases. And I always viewed myself as the last protector of the criminal defendant's constitutional rights. I mean, someone who's charged with a crime is always at a disadvantage compared to the government. I mean, when the government is coming into court, they have essentially unlimited resources. They have the power, they have the control. And so, well, in this instance, James Comey has very, very competent lawyers to protect him. The judge is the one that's there to make sure this whole process is fair. I mean, it's just like, I think Chief Justice Roberts said during his confirmation hearings, a judge is an umpire. A judge is there to make sure that the rules get enforced, to call balls and strikes. And in this particular instance, where a runner's out at home, the judge makes that call. And for sure on these vindictive prosecution motions, the judges are going to have to be the ones to put their foot down and say, you know what, this isn't fair. This is deprivation of the defendant's, in this instance, Fifth Amendment due process right, and I'm not going to let it go forward. And that's what's going to have to happen.
Let's talk a little bit. Well, first, before we do that, I know you had at least one criminal case that I saw on television. Wasn't a case in your courtroom featured on one of the national crime dramas
I,
on network television?
Yeah, if your listeners ever see it come up, it is Murder in the Big Sky on Dateline. It's a 2-hour Dateline, by the way. And Dateline, this was a 3-week murder trial here in Montana that I got called in to preside over. It was a cold case, and as I told Dateline, and they used it in their little soundbite about the ad, it's your classic whodunit. I mean, there could have been 10 people who killed this guy in a small town veterinarian in Montana. And, it's just your classic Dateline story. So it was kind of fun to Dateline filmed, the 3 weeks of trial. They had 3 terabytes worth of video from this trial, and they compressed it down to a 2-hour episode. And it was kind of fun to see, having observed the whole trial, how they portrayed who they thought did it, and it was just it was kind of a fun experience. And since there was no appeal, I was able to sort of participate in this Dateline interview, which was kind of fun.
I'm sure that real justice was done in that case, and it probably wasn't a political case.
It
But
was not a political case, that's for sure. But it was funny as my law. It was held about in a town of Fort Benton, Montana, about 60 miles from here in Great Falls. And my law clerk and I were driving back and forth every day, and we found ourselves saying, "Oh my gosh, I think that person did it. No, maybe this person did it, and well, maybe they did it." And we finally dawned on ourselves that there's no way the jury's going to really convict this guy, because look at the debate we're having about who did it. So, but the way it plays out is kind of fun.
yeah, they have to convict beyond a reasonable doubt. And
Right.
if you, as the judge and the law clerk, had your doubts, certainly the jurors did too. Let's talk a little bit about the history of lawfare, which is a
Yeah.
newish term. I don't remember hearing about the word lawfare until President Trump himself was being charged with collusion, insurrection, racketeering, conspiracy, fraud, even sexual assault. Some of these cases were stronger than others legally. Were any of them legitimate charges to bring, in your view?
Well, lawfare, it began, decades ago. It was a concept that was used by the military, and it was actually a
Oh,
military term that related to the concept of using laws to affect national security change. And this is done more on an international basis. And so, but it wasn't a mainstream concept. I mean, it was just sort of a military term of art, and it's since been one that's been morphed into, Trump saying that, these opponents of his, or those affected, challenging his policies, are using the legal system to engage in political warfare. But that's really what he's doing. I mean, he's doing the same thing as well. So, I mean, I think it doesn't serve any real purpose to get into a tit for tat about, who started this, right? Who started this? Our legal system has been used in this way to try to affect change since its inception, but it has just taken on sort of heightened awareness, right? I mean, I think when I double checked the figures before coming on here, there's been something like 234 pending lawsuits that have been filed related to the administration policies. I mean, that is unparalleled and unheard of. And roughly a third of those, have indefinite holds on the policies. And so, and the appeals that are happening and immediately going to the Supreme Court, and the extensive use of the Supreme Court emergency docket, like, it is really changing the legal landscape in this country, and it's having dramatic ramifications on the court system and the political system for sure.
the first political case I'm old enough to remember, you're not old enough to remember, and that was the Watergate impeachment case.
Right.
That was followed later by an impeachment case against Bill Clinton in much different circumstances we don't need to go into here. Then there was Al Gore's attempt to change the result of the 2000 election in Florida. You remember the hanging chads
Oh,
and
yeah.
all of that. Another impeachment case followed in 2020 after President Trump had a phone call with Zelensky, wanting Zelensky to launch an investigation of the Biden family. Soon thereafter, were many lawsuits filed by President Trump about the results of the 2020 election. And then there was another impeachment about the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, and whether Trump was responsible for that and should be impeached. Those are cases. Those impeachment cases are cases in a sense, although they're in Congress, not in a courtroom. But is all of this litigiousness now, the cases you mentioned as well, just a perpetual state of affairs?
I'm afraid that it is. And it makes you question why, you know, good lawyers, well qualified lawyers, would want to, take on these tasks. I mean, you look at someone like Jack Smith, who, took on the task of leaving a very successful law practice to take on, the role with the Department of Justice to prosecute Trump, and now he's back in the crosshairs. You look at somebody like James Comey, you look at any of these folks, right? Why would they want to do this, to open themselves up to this kind of scrutiny, public hatred by at least a portion of the population, the monetary effects of it, being charged with a crime? I mean, I can't imagine that James Comey, who by all accounts has had a very distinguished career, and he has his critics, and stuff that happened back in the 2016 election with Hillary Clinton and all that stuff and everything. But be that as it may, he's had a distinguished career. I can't imagine that he ever thought that after being a U.S. attorney, being a director of the FBI, that he would find himself as a criminal defendant.
And now
I
his
think this
daughter's even being gone after, I
right.
think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a sad state of affairs. I think, it's going to discourage qualified people from wanting to go into public service because it's not worth it. And the other thing is, you know, at some point, inevitably, there will be a turnover in the political parties of this country. And so, I think, and even some Republicans have sort of cautiously reminded folks that we may not be in the majority forever. And the things that we're doing now are going to be used against us at some point in the future, right? I mean, the Democrats will be in control of the Senate and the House and the White House at some point. And when that happens, all this stuff is going to perpetuate, right? Because it's like, okay, well, you know what? They did this to us. We're going to turn around and do the same thing to them. And I just, as a student of politics, as a lawyer, as a former judge, who believes in our constitutional democracy, I just think the whole state of affairs across the board is just is really a sad and unfortunate state of affairs.
I read this quote recently, Greg. Democrats introduced lawfare, at least in politics, and as the master retaliator, Donald Trump is perfecting its use. So my
Yeah.
next question is political, not legal per se. And I know you, like me, are interested in politics. Did the Democrats make a strategic political mistake in going after Donald Trump so hard?
Well, I don't think so. And in the sense that you have to do what is right. And I mean, the Democrats have used this lawfare, if you want to call it that, before it was even a term in this context. They've used it against themselves. I mean, look back at Bill Clinton, right? And look at, I mean, there was a special counsel appointed when when he was elected in 1992 and fired a couple of people in the White House travel office, the Whitewater deal that he lost money on 10 years before he even became president, right? And so it was Bill Clinton. He had his attorney general, Janet Reno, appointed a special prosecutor. That's an independent counsel. That's what led to Ken Starr, right? And so, I think in that instance, the Democrats thought that was the right thing to do with their own president. And it's just kind of astonishing to me. I mean, it seems like at this, looking in hindsight, right, firing a couple people from the travel office, wow, that was a scandal. I mean, as a student of politics, I look back on that. That was an absolute scandal at the time. And wow, how far we have come from that being a scandal to where we are now.
Are you worried as a former judge that all of this political strife being played out in the courts leads to the disparagement of judges,
Yeah.
jurors, and our legal system as a whole? And does this lead to reduced credibility of everyone involved in the system, including Supreme Court justices?
100%. 100%. I mean, you look back over the last 25 years and, the confidence level 25 years ago that Americans had in the Supreme Court approached 70%. Now it barely approaches 40%. So we have seen an absolute decline in the faith in our court system. And I think, our court system has always been viewed traditionally as sort of above the political fray, right? And as arbiters that, although they're appointed by politicians, that they're somewhat above that. And that has diminished. And I think these attacks and the general attitude in the country, which is very combatant and upsetting, it has led to an eroding of the faith in our institutions of government. But most profoundly for me is our judicial system. And we've seen the attacks on judges. We've seen the attacks on their families. I mean, in my own personal life, I've had a stalker that has been part of me and my family's life. Just 3 months ago, he was sentenced for the third time in 10 years for stalking me and my family, even to this day, right? I mean, an individual who I was involved in his life for literally 5 minutes and has impacted me and my family for 10 years, to the point he's gone to my kids' schools. gone to my wife's workplace. He has, sent packages that look like the Unabomber, put them together to me. Like it
Mhm.
is, that there's no place for that kind of stuff. I mean, and we've seen that in the acts of political violence in Minnesota, and even President Trump. I mean, this notion, the tenor of the conversation in our country has really reached a boiling point, and one that's totally unacceptable on every level, and that is carrying over into the judicial system. And folks losing faith in that system, it's going to be it's going to have really dramatic effects.
I remember when I was in law school in the 1980s, the Supreme Court was revered. And if the Supreme Court had ruled on something, it was highly respected and considered to be, by definition, correct. Now, whoever loses a case in the Supreme Court says the justices are leftist lunatics, or they're racist, right wingers or whatever. And I even saw this recently. Amy Coney Barrett from Notre Dame was appointed to the Supreme Court, and people presumptively thought she was going to be terrible because she would be too far to the right. Then she actually ruled against President Trump on a couple of things, and then people on the far right hated her because she was some kind of a traitor. And the same thing happened to Harry Blackmun after Nixon appointed him, and then he ended up ruling on Roe versus Wade. So I don't think any of this is good when we draw our conclusions about whether someone is a good judge or a bad judge based on whether they rule in our favor. But I'm sure that you experience that as a judge, even in non-political cases.
Oh my gosh. I always said, look, I'm only as popular as my last ruling, right? And you rule for somebody, and you're the most brilliant person to ever wear a robe, right? You rule against somebody and you're, just an idiot who didn't get it. And the funny thing about that is that, lawyers think that about judges, right? And when you're a trial judge and you get appealed, and you get a reversal back from the Supreme Court, you read the opinion of your case that you decided, and you're like, oh man, those seven judges, they didn't get it. What the heck were they thinking when they ruled this?
They're
So it's
idiots.
all, yeah, they're idiots. It's all a matter of perspective. And yeah, I mean, I think so that's always been there to some degree, right? But we've always been able to I think we've always been able to count on the U.S. Supreme Court to be somewhat above the fray. I mean, we know what people's political, judicial ideologies are when they are appointed, right? But at the same time, we had justices like Anthony Kennedy, Republican appointee, David Souter, Republican appointee, that weren't just sort of lockstep with traditional Republican political ideologies, right? And I mean, even for that matter, I mean, I'll give credit where credit is due with Antonin Scalia, right? Who the right wing sort of champions. I mean, you knew exactly what you were going to get with Justice Scalia, and he was true to that, right? And so I think now, we're seeing the justices be political animals in a sense, and that's unfortunate. And I just think it totally erodes the faith and confidence that people have in judges to be something more than just politicians. I mean, traditionally people don't really trust politicians, but they don't even trust lawyers. But for some reason, when somebody puts on a black robe, there's been a level of trust that goes there. Judges are sort of above the fray, but that's eroding, and that's sad, and unfortunate.
Yeah. My experience as a lawyer is the only lawyer people like is their own lawyer. And
Right.
the other side's lawyer is always an idiot, but theirs is a genius. Uh,
I
uh,
went to this conference once where I don't know, there was some survey of people's ranking of professions that they liked, and the bottom three, I don't remember in what order, it doesn't matter, were lawyers, journalists, and politicians. And I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I've been one of all three at some point or another in my life. And so I don't have very much going for me in this world. But to my wife's credit, a nurse was number one on the profession for some reason. And so she reminds me of that a lot.
Well, and for good reason. Yeah, I used that line when I ran for Congress last year. What am I doing here? I went to journalism school and was a journalist. Then I went to law school and was a lawyer. And I suppose I could be a used car salesman. They're right up there too. But instead, I'm running for Congress, the lowest of all possible ratings. But
Well, and as a mediator yourself, that's basically what you are as a mediator, as a used car salesman. I mean, I just did a mediation the other day where I told the party, it was toward the end of the process, and I said, "This is the point in the day when there's no skill in being a mediator. I'm just selling a used car here, and we're haggling back and forth."
exactly. Well, I want to close by asking you about a couple of public service works
Yeah,
you've done outside your courtroom where you're a judge and outside your own law firm now. And one is your service on the Uniform Laws Commission. What is
yeah.
that?
The Uniform Law Commission, it's a legal organization that probably not many people in the country have heard of. It's been around since 1892, and every state appoints commissioners to the Uniform Law Commission, and we meet once a year. There's 300 commissioners, all lawyers, but primarily there's judges, there are practicing lawyers, there are law professors who get together and they try to come up with legislation to make laws uniform across the states. So, of course, we have our federal laws, which would be uniform across the country, but the most of the laws that really and truly affect people are enacted on a statewide basis, and they vary by degree. The law in California is very different than the law in Minnesota. And so the Uniform Law Commission identifies areas of the law that would benefit from uniformity. So an example of that, some people may have heard of the Uniform Probate Code or the Uniform Commercial Code. Those are all products of the Uniform Law Commission, where it makes sense to have a uniform commercial code where the structure for doing business and how goods and services are bought and sold across the states have the same legal principles, so that a company buying goods in the state of Washington is going to be subject to the same regulation that happens in the state of Texas. And so the Uniform Law Commission tries to identify these areas. It's a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. You don't get paid for being a commissioner, and they've really tried to identify those areas that could benefit the country.
And with my political hat always on, I have thought about what's been one of the main divisive political issues where there's not consistency from state to state, and it's particularly a state issue now that Dobbs overturned Roe versus Wade, and that's abortion.
Mm.
Am I crazy, or couldn't the Uniform Laws Commission come up with a recommended, and I know it would have to be adopted by the state's uniform law on abortion?
Well, they could, but it would never happen. Number one, just never happen, right? So the Uniform Law Commission, for the most part, is a nonpartisan organization, tries to steer clear of sort of controversial areas that would be subject to debate in the states, right? And so the Uniform Probate Code, for instance, when somebody dies, their estate goes into probate. Those aren't terribly controversial issues, and they benefit from having a standardized law across the country. Something like abortion, number one, with 300 commissioners with varying backgrounds in their states, the Uniform Law Commission could never agree on it. But then their acts that they pass, the uniform codes, only become law in the states when the states actually adopt them. And so, given the diversity of opinion, California has a very different view of abortion than Texas does. And so it's just something that could happen but won't happen.
Yeah. Criminal sentencing and bail, are there any uniform criminal laws?
They have undertaken debate about issues on bail reform and things like that, and even getting into an area that they've gotten into is child custody. Right, there's a Uniform Child Custody Enforcement Act, so that if somebody moves to from one state to another state, the custodial orders are enforceable. They're enforceable across state lines, and so it's really more things like that benefit from not individualized circumstances, but across the board changes to the law.
Lastly, tell us about your work with veterans courts. I know that's
Yeah,
the nearest and dearest issue to your heart. What is that all about?
it is. And this is an example of sort of the things that the justice system does on a very local level that impact people's lives, that impact communities, that don't have anything to do with politics. And one example of those, I mean, drug treatment courts have been around since the late 80s. Started in Miami, Florida, and now every state has a drug treatment court where you're helping people with substance use problems overcome those issues that are getting them involved in the justice system. I said as a judge, I spent 90% of my time dealing with one of four things: people dealing drugs, possessing drugs, committing crimes to get drugs, or committing crimes while they're on drugs. And the war on drugs that really started with Nixon, but was perpetuated by President Reagan, it was really an absolute failure of a criminal justice policy. It didn't work. We were incarcerating people that didn't need to be incarcerated. It was expensive. And, there's nearly a 70% recidivism rate for someone coming out of prison. So the concept of these treatment courts to address the root cause of what's bringing somebody in the justice system has been around, for several decades. An offshoot of that is veterans treatment courts. So one of the things that, as a judge, me and other judges around the country were seeing, particularly as Iraq and Afghanistan veterans were coming back, is that we were seeing veterans with no criminal records that were becoming involved in the justice system for the first time. And for the most part, they were dealing with substance use disorders, mental health conditions that they weren't receiving treatment for, and that was resulting in them them coming into the justice system. I'll give you one anecdote of an individual who came into my justice system. This young man did 3 tours, had no criminal record. He did 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Suffered a traumatic brain injury in a mortar attack. Recipient of Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts. After he came back from Iraq and Afghanistan, he was stationed with the Honor Guard at Arlington Cemetery, performed over 5,000 funerals at Arlington Cemetery. And given what he'd been through, it's understandable when he came back into the community, honorably discharged, came back into the community, that he had a lot of problems. I mean, he couldn't sleep at night from his PTSD. So he started to drink. When the drinking didn't work to help him go to sleep, he started taking more and more of his medications. Well, that helped him sleep, but then he couldn't get up in the morning, lost his job, lost his house. And one day, in an act of desperation, he holds up a convenience store with a BB gun, gets $11, and his car breaks down on his way out. This is a guy who now is facing, a mandatory minimum sentence of 3 years in prison, up to 40 years in prison. And that's not what he needs. That's not what he did is wrong, but that's not what he needs. What he needs is to address those issues that brought him into the justice system. And that's where the Veterans Treatment Courts comes in. The Veterans Treatment Courts, which are now around the country, have helped set up Veterans Treatment Courts in over 40 states now, including in Minnesota. And they help these veterans. I mean, we connect them with services with the VA. They're in court every single week. They're reporting to a probation officer every week. They're getting drug tested 3 times a week. They're going to their mental health appointments. And when they come into court the next week, as the judge, I'm holding them accountable for what they need to do in order to get healthy. And a veterans treatment court, the statistics speak for themselves. On a national basis, the recidivism rate for somebody going through a veterans treatment court is less than 20%.
Wow.
And in my court, it was less than $5,000 in cost to put someone through a veterans treatment court, and compared to prison, right? Send somebody to prison in Montana is almost $50,000 a year. Some states it's over $70,000 a year. And again, there's a recidivism rate that approaches 70% when someone comes out of prison. So these programs work; they're the right thing to do, and it remains a passion of mine. It's next to adoptions. It is the only thing that I miss from my time as a judge. And I'm very thankful that I can continue to be involved on a national level, helping states get the training and resources that they need in order to implement these courts.
Wow, excellent. Thank you for that. You're helping a lot of people, and I know you're underselling your involvement. You've been the driving force in this, and thank you for that. That's wonderful service to the country, helping veterans.
Yeah, well, and now my son is in the military, and so he's on active duty in the Coast Guard, and so it kind of takes on even some heightened importance to me now. But it was really a privilege of mine to. I'm not a veteran, and so it was a privilege of mine to be able to help these men and women really get on the right track. And I still hear from them, still communicate with them. It's really a heartwarming, when you spend your day as a judge, sort of, I always said, taking away people's liberty, I'm taking away their marriages, I'm taking away their kids. That's not a pleasant job to have. And when you can see the transformation of a human being before your eyes through a veterans treatment court, treatment courts generally, it's really a satisfying experience, personally and professionally.
Yeah, well, that was your privilege, and it's been my privilege to have you on this
Yes.
podcast today, Greg. I really appreciate it. You were fantastic. I'm sure the listeners have enjoyed it. So thank you. Very
Well, let
satisfying.
me let me return the thank you. I mean, what your listeners really need to know from my standpoint is really my admiration for you. It is my privilege and honor to be on here to talk to you. You taught me how to be a lawyer. I mean, you were my first mentor in the practice of law, and so for better or worse, everything that I know and do as a lawyer is really a tribute to you, Quentin, and I mean that genuinely. So
If we
thank
had
you for having me.
another hour, we could talk about our experiences on 9/11, 2001, when
Right?
we were in the midst of a jury trial when the World Trade Center was attacked. But we'll save that for another day, and
Perfect.
all of our other war stories. I'll be looking forward to having you back at some point, and
Love to.
thank you again. On the next episode of Extremely Non-Extreme, be episode 13, I'll have a pre-election uh, episode where we'll analyze what's happening in the 2025 elections, which are coming up. People are already voting early in some places, and on November 4th in others. So until then, thank you all. Thanks again, Greg, and we will see you next time.